Bill Gates disappeared for a week twice a year throughout his tenure at Microsoft, taking what he called Think Weeks, 7 days of complete solitude with nothing but books, papers, and his thoughts. No meetings, no phone calls, no interruptions. Many thought he was wasting valuable time. Instead, some of his most revolutionary decisions, including the pivot to internet-first strategy, emerged from these periods of deliberate isolation. What if the greatest leadership breakthroughs don't come from more collaboration, but from strategic solitude? There's a fundamental paradox at the heart of effective leadership that most people never recognize. Leadership is ultimately about serving others, building teams, and creating collective success. Yet some of the most crucial leadership work happens when you're completely alone. This isn't a contradiction. It's one of the most powerful principles the Stoics understood about developing wisdom, clarity, and authentic strength. Modern leadership culture has created what I call the always-on trap. We've convinced ourselves that good leaders are constantly available, perpetually collaborative, and endlessly responsive to their teams and stakeholders. The result is leaders who are chronically overstimulated, reactive rather than reflective, and making decisions based on the loudest voice in the room rather than their deepest wisdom. Let me introduce you to Amanda Foster, a composite character representing dozens of executives I've worked with over the years. Amanda was promoted to Chief Technology Officer of a growing fintech company, responsible for a team of 120 engineers across 4 time zones. Her calendar was packed from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. with back-to-back meetings, and her phone buzzed constantly with Slack messages, emails, and urgent requests for decisions. She prided herself on being accessible and responsive, believing this made her an effective leader. But Amanda was making a crucial mistake that was undermining her leadership effectiveness. She had eliminated virtually all opportunities for solitary reflection from her schedule. Every decision was made in the context of immediate pressure and competing voices. Every strategic thought was interrupted by tactical demands. She was so busy being responsive that she had no time to be wise. The turning point came during a particularly challenging product launch when multiple crises hit simultaneously. A security vulnerability discovered 3 days before release, a key engineer's resignation, and pressure from investors to maintain the timeline despite these setbacks. Amanda's initial response was to schedule even more meetings, bring more people into the decision-making process, and seek input from anyone who might have relevant perspective. The result was chaos. Too many opinions, conflicting advice, and decision paralysis when speed was essential. It was her mentor, a former CEO who had successfully navigated similar crises, who suggested something that initially seemed counterintuitive. Stop talking to everyone else for 12 hours and spend time alone figuring out what you actually think needs to happen. Amanda was skeptical. How could stepping away from collaboration help when she needed all the input she could get? But desperate times called for different approaches. She blocked out the next morning, told her assistant to hold all non-emergency calls, and spent 4 hours alone with the problem. No advisors, no stakeholders, no team members. Just her, the facts, and the quiet space to think clearly about what really mattered. In those 4 hours of solitude, Amanda achieved something that weeks of meetings hadn't accomplished. She gained clarity about priorities, identified the core issues that needed to be addressed versus the peripheral concerns that were creating noise, and developed a clear action plan that balanced security concerns with business objectives. When she reconvened with her team, she wasn't seeking more input. She was providing clear direction based on thoughtful analysis. The launch succeeded, but more importantly, Amanda discovered something the Stoics had understood for centuries. Solitude isn't escape from leadership responsibility. It's preparation for more effective leadership engagement. When you regularly spend time alone with your thoughts, you develop what Epictetus called the faculty of choice, the ability to make decisions based on wisdom and principle rather than external pressure and immediate emotions. This understanding revolutionized Amanda's approach to leadership. Instead of viewing solitude as selfish or unproductive, she began to see it as essential preparation for serving others effectively. She started blocking out what she called thinking time in her schedule, periods where she was unavailable for meetings or reactive decision-making, focused instead on strategic reflection and careful consideration of important issues. The Stoic philosophers were remarkably clear about why solitude is essential for developing character and wisdom. Marcus Aurelius wrote his Meditations during quiet moments stolen from the demands of ruling an empire. Seneca wrote letters during early morning hours before the business of Roman politics consumed his day. Epictetus taught that we must regularly withdraw from external demands to examine our thoughts, clarify our values, and align our actions with our principles. But let's be clear about what we mean by leadership solitude. This isn't about becoming a hermit or avoiding necessary collaboration. It's about understanding that your capacity to serve others effectively depends on your ability to think clearly, and thinking clearly requires protection from constant external input and stimulation. It's about recognizing that some of your most important work as a leader happens when no one else is around. The research supporting this principle is overwhelming. Studies from leading business schools consistently show that executives who engage in regular solitary reflection demonstrate superior strategic thinking, better decision-making under pressure, and greater emotional regulation during challenging periods. They're also more creative in problem-solving and more confident in their leadership decisions. Why does solitude have this effect? Because it creates space for what neuroscientists call diffuse thinking, the type of mental processing that generates insights, connections, and creative solutions. When your brain isn't responding to immediate stimuli and external demands, it can engage in the kind of deep processing that leads to breakthrough thinking. This is why great ideas often come during walks, showers, or quiet moments rather than during brainstorming meetings or collaborative sessions. But there's a deeper principle at work here that goes beyond cognitive function. Solitude forces you to confront your own thoughts, values, and motivations without the influence or validation of others. This confrontation is uncomfortable for many leaders who have become dependent on external feedback and constant collaboration to feel confident in their decisions. However, this discomfort is precisely what makes solitude so valuable for leadership development. When you're alone with a difficult decision, you can't rely on consensus, popular opinion, or the comfort of shared responsibility. You must examine the situation based on your own analysis, your own values, and your own understanding of what's right and necessary. This process develops what the Stoics called inner authority, the confidence to make difficult decisions based on principle rather than external validation. Consider the difference between leaders who regularly engage in solitary reflection and those who don't. The first group tends to be more decisive, more consistent in their values-based decision-making, and more resilient during challenging periods. They're less likely to be swayed by the latest opinion or thrown off course by temporary setbacks. They've developed an internal compass that guides their leadership even when external circumstances are chaotic or uncertain. The second group, while often well-intentioned and collaborative, tends to be more reactive, more dependent on consensus, and more vulnerable to decision paralysis when facing complex challenges. They've trained themselves to rely so heavily on external input that they struggle to access their own wisdom and judgment when it's most needed. What makes this particularly relevant for modern leaders is the unprecedented level of noise and distraction we face. Social media, 24/7 news cycles, constant connectivity, and the expectation of immediate responsiveness create an environment where sustained thinking becomes increasingly difficult. Without deliberately creating space for solitude, leaders find themselves making important decisions based on incomplete thinking and reactive emotions rather than careful analysis and clear principles. The Stoic approach to solitude isn't about isolation or withdrawal from responsibility. It's about strategic retreat that enables more effective engagement. Just as athletes need recovery time between training sessions to build strength, leaders need thinking time between periods of intense interaction to develop wisdom and clarity. The goal isn't to avoid the challenges of leadership, but to approach them with greater preparation and deeper insight. Understanding the value of solitude is one thing. Actually implementing it as a leadership practice is another challenge entirely. Most leaders face genuine constraints, packed schedules, stakeholder expectations, and organizational cultures that equate constant availability with commitment and effectiveness. The key is developing what I call solitude architecture, systematic approaches to creating and protecting thinking space within the demands of leadership responsibility. The first architectural element involves distinguishing between different types of solitude for different leadership purposes. Not all alone time serves the same function, and effective leaders learn to use various forms of strategic withdrawal for specific outcomes. What I call daily clearing involves brief periods of uninterrupted thinking time, usually 15 to 30 minutes, focused on processing recent experiences and preparing for upcoming challenges. This isn't deep strategic planning, but rather mental maintenance that prevents the accumulation of stress and confusion that comes from constant reactive engagement. Jonathan Martinez, a regional sales director for a pharmaceutical company, discovered the power of daily clearing during one of the most challenging periods of his career. His team was struggling to meet ambitious targets while adapting to new regulatory requirements that complicated their sales process. Instead of working longer hours and scheduling more meetings, Jonathan started arriving at the office 30 minutes early each day to sit quietly with his thoughts before checking email or engaging with his team. During these sessions, Jonathan would review the previous day's interactions, consider which challenges required immediate attention versus those that could wait, and think about how he wanted to approach difficult conversations or decisions. He wasn't trying to solve every problem during this time, but rather to create mental clarity about priorities and approaches. The impact was immediate and significant. His team noticed that he seemed calmer and more decisive, and his own stress levels decreased dramatically despite facing the same external pressures. The second type of solitude involves what I call strategic withdrawal, longer periods, typically several hours to a full day, focused on major decisions, strategic planning, or working through complex challenges. This is where leaders do their deepest thinking about direction, values, and the long-term implications of important choices. It requires more significant protection from interruptions and more deliberate preparation than daily clearing. Consider how Rebecca Thompson, Chief Operating Officer of a manufacturing company, used strategic withdrawal when facing a critical decision about whether to automate a significant portion of their production process. The decision would affect hundreds of jobs, require substantial capital investment, and fundamentally change the company's operational model. Instead of immediately convening committees and seeking extensive input, Rebecca first spent 2 full days alone analyzing the situation from multiple perspectives. She examined financial projections, considered competitive implications, thought through implementation challenges, and most importantly, reflected on how different approaches aligned with the company's values and long-term vision. She considered not just what was financially optimal, but what was ethically sound and strategically wise. Only after this solitary analysis did she begin seeking input from others, but now she was asking specific questions based on clear thinking rather than seeking general opinions about a complex situation. The third architectural element involves creating what the Stoics called philosophical reflection. Regular periods focused not on immediate business challenges, but on examining your own leadership approach, values, and character development. This is perhaps the most neglected aspect of leadership development, yet it's often the most transformative. It involves honestly assessing your performance, considering feedback you've received, and thinking about how you want to grow as a leader. Marcus Aurelius demonstrated this practice through his meditations, where he regularly examined his own thoughts, motivations, and actions. Modern leaders can adapt this approach by setting aside time weekly or monthly to consider questions like, how well am I living up to my stated values? What patterns do I notice in my decision-making that serve me well or poorly? Where am I allowing external pressures to compromise my integrity or effectiveness? How can I better serve the people and purposes I'm responsible for? This type of reflection requires genuine solitude because it involves confronting uncomfortable truths about yourself that you might avoid or rationalize in the presence of others. It's during these private moments of honest self-examination that real character development occurs, and character is ultimately what determines leadership effectiveness over the long term. The practical challenge most leaders face is protecting these different types of solitude from the constant demands for their attention and availability. This requires both tactical strategies and cultural change within their organizations. Tactically, it means treating thinking time with the same respect you would give to any other important business activity. Block it on your calendar, communicate its importance to your team, and resist the temptation to sacrifice it when other demands arise. But the deeper challenge is cultural. Many organizations have developed cultures where constant availability is seen as dedication and regular solitude is viewed as disengagement. Changing this requires leaders to model different behavior and help their teams understand the connection between thinking time and decision quality. When you make better decisions because you've had time to think clearly, and when you communicate those decisions more effectively because you've had time to consider multiple perspectives, people begin to understand that your solitude serves their interests as well as your own. One of the most effective approaches is what I call transparent solitude, explicitly communicating to your team when you're taking thinking time and why. Instead of just blocking out time on your calendar, explain that you're working on strategic analysis or reflecting on recent challenges. Share insights that emerge from these periods and help people understand how solitary reflection contributes to better leadership decisions. This transparency serves multiple purposes. It normalizes the practice of taking thinking time, which encourages others to do the same. It demonstrates that solitude is work, not avoidance of work. And it helps create organizational cultures that value deep thinking alongside collaborative interaction. The question that often arises is how to balance solitude with the genuine need for input, collaboration, and stakeholder engagement that leadership requires. The answer isn't choosing between solitude and collaboration, but understanding how they complement each other. The most effective leaders alternate between periods of gathering input and periods of processing that input in solitude. They seek advice and perspective from others, but they also create space to synthesize that information according to their own analysis and values. This approach actually makes collaboration more effective because you bring clearer thinking and more specific questions to your interactions with others. Instead of using meetings as opportunities to think out loud or hoping that group discussion will generate clarity, you come prepared with preliminary analysis and focused questions about areas where additional input would be most valuable. There's also an important distinction between solitude and isolation that's crucial for leadership effectiveness. Isolation involves cutting yourself off from necessary information, feedback, and relationships. Solitude involves temporarily withdrawing from interaction to process information more effectively and think more clearly. The goal of leadership solitude is always to enhance your ability to serve others, not to avoid the responsibilities that serving others requires. The most successful leaders I've worked with treat solitude as a leadership competency that requires development like any other skill. They start with small experiments, perhaps 15 minutes of uninterrupted thinking time each morning, and gradually build their capacity for longer periods of strategic reflection. They learn to recognize when they need thinking time versus when they need input from others. Most importantly, they develop confidence in their own thinking process and trust in their ability to make good decisions when given adequate time for reflection. This confidence is perhaps the most valuable outcome of regular leadership solitude. When you know you can think clearly and thoroughly about complex challenges, you become less dependent on external validation and less reactive to immediate pressures. You develop what the Stoics called inner authority, the ability to make difficult decisions based on careful analysis and clear principles rather than popular opinion or immediate emotions. Think of solitude as strength training for your leadership capabilities. Just as physical exercise creates controlled stress that builds muscle and cardiovascular capacity, strategic solitude creates controlled intellectual and emotional challenges that develop wisdom, resilience, and decision-making capability. The parallel isn't metaphorical, it's neuroscientifically accurate. Regular periods of sustained thinking literally strengthen the neural pathways associated with executive function, emotional regulation, and creative problem-solving. This becomes particularly important when we consider what researchers call decision fatigue. Every choice you make throughout the day depletes a finite cognitive resource, which is why your decision-making quality tends to deteriorate as the day progresses. Leaders face an unusually high volume of decisions, many of them complex and consequential, which means they're particularly vulnerable to this cognitive depletion. Strategic solitude serves as cognitive recovery time that restores your mental resources and improves subsequent decision-making quality. Let me share the story of Thomas Kim, a hospital administrator who managed one of the largest emergency departments on the West Coast. Thomas was responsible for decisions that literally affected life and death outcomes: staffing during crisis periods, resource allocation during emergencies, and policy changes that impacted patient care quality. The constant pressure and rapid-fire decision-making had worn him down to the point where he was making mistakes that could have serious consequences. Thomas's breakthrough came when he started what he called reset sessions, 20-minute periods between major decisions where he would step into a quiet office, close his eyes, and simply breathe while letting his mind process recent experiences. These weren't meditation sessions in the traditional sense, but rather deliberate pauses that allowed his cognitive resources to recover before engaging with the next challenge. The impact was remarkable. Thomas noticed that his decision-making in the late afternoon and evening became significantly better. He was less likely to snap at team members under pressure, more likely to notice important details he might have missed when cognitively depleted, and more creative in finding solutions to complex problems. His staff began commenting on his increased steadiness and clarity, even during the most chaotic periods. But the strength-building aspect of solitude goes beyond cognitive recovery. When you spend time alone with difficult thoughts and challenging emotions, you develop what psychologists call distress tolerance, the ability to remain functional and effective even when experiencing uncomfortable internal states. This is crucial for leadership because difficult emotions are inevitable when you're responsible for important outcomes and other people's well-being. Most leaders try to avoid or suppress difficult emotions, which actually weakens their emotional resilience over time. The Stoic approach involves deliberately spending time with challenging thoughts and feelings in a controlled environment where you can practice responding to them with wisdom rather than reactivity. This is like gradually increasing weights in physical exercise. You're building your capacity to handle greater emotional loads without losing your effectiveness. Consider the practice of what Seneca called voluntary discomfort, deliberately exposing yourself to minor hardships to build resilience for major challenges. For modern leaders, this might involve spending time thinking about worst-case scenarios without immediately seeking reassurance or distraction. It could mean sitting with feelings of uncertainty about important decisions without rushing to premature conclusions. Or it might involve honestly confronting feedback about your leadership performance without becoming defensive or dismissive. Angela Rodriguez, a nonprofit executive director, exemplified this approach during a particularly challenging funding crisis. Instead of immediately seeking comfort from colleagues or diving into busywork to avoid thinking about the implications, Angela spent several hours alone honestly considering what would happen if they couldn't secure additional funding. She thought through potential layoffs, program cuts, and the impact on communities they served. This wasn't pessimistic rumination or catastrophic thinking. It was deliberate emotional strength training. By confronting her fears in a controlled environment, Angela was able to think clearly about preventive measures and contingency plans. More importantly, when she met with potential funders, she could discuss challenges honestly and confidently because she had already processed her anxiety about potential outcomes. The solitude also revealed something unexpected. While considering worst-case scenarios, Angela realized that some of the programs they might need to cut were actually less effective than others, and that a funding crisis might force beneficial changes they had been avoiding for political reasons. This insight, which emerged during solitary reflection, ultimately led to strategic improvements that made the organization stronger regardless of funding outcomes. This illustrates another crucial aspect of solitude as strength training. It often reveals opportunities and insights that aren't visible when you're constantly responding to external demands. When your mind isn't occupied with immediate tactical concerns, it can engage in what researchers call divergent thinking, the type of mental processing that generates creative solutions and strategic insights. The key is learning to distinguish between productive solitary reflection and unproductive rumination. Productive reflection involves examining situations from multiple perspectives, considering various approaches, and thinking through implications of different choices. It's goal-oriented and leads to greater clarity or specific actions. Unproductive rumination involves repetitive worry about problems without moving toward solutions, often accompanied by self-criticism or catastrophic thinking. Stoic solitude practices include specific techniques for keeping reflection productive. One approach involves time-boxing your thinking sessions, setting specific periods for considering particular challenges rather than allowing concerns to occupy your mind throughout the day. Another technique involves ending solitary reflection sessions by identifying specific next steps or decisions, even if those decisions involve seeking additional information or input from others. The strength-building aspect of solitude also extends to developing what the Stoics called Philosophical resilience. The ability to maintain your values and principles even when facing significant pressure to compromise them. This type of resilience only develops through practice, and practice requires creating situations where you can examine your values and consider how to apply them to difficult circumstances. Regular solitary reflection on ethical challenges helps you clarify your principles before you face situations where those principles will be tested. It's much easier to act with integrity during a crisis if you've already thought carefully about what integrity means in various contexts. Conversely, leaders who never spend time examining their values often find themselves making compromises they later regret because they haven't developed the mental clarity to recognize ethical implications in the moment. This brings us to one of the most important aspects of solitude as leadership development. It builds what I call authentic authority. This is the type of leadership influence that comes from inner clarity and genuine wisdom rather than external position or formal power. Authentic authority emerges when people sense that your decisions and actions arise from careful thought and clear principles rather than immediate reactions or political calculations. Authentic authority can't be faked or manufactured through external techniques. It develops through the internal work of examining your thoughts, clarifying your values, and practicing the application of those values to complex situations. This internal work necessarily happens in solitude because it requires the kind of honest self-examination that's difficult to maintain in the presence of others. Leaders with authentic authority don't need to convince people to follow them through charisma or manipulation. People naturally trust their judgment because they sense the depth of thought and strength of character behind their decisions. This type of influence is particularly powerful during uncertain or challenging periods when people are looking for leaders who seem grounded and clear about direction. But developing authentic authority through solitude requires what the Stoics called brutal honesty with yourself. This means acknowledging your limitations, examining your motivations, and confronting uncomfortable truths about your performance and character. It's much easier to maintain flattering self-images when you're constantly surrounded by people who depend on you and therefore hesitate to challenge you directly. Solitude removes these external buffers and forces you to confront reality without the comfort of rationalization or external validation. This confrontation is uncomfortable, but it's also liberating. When you've honestly examined your weaknesses and limitations in private, you're less vulnerable to defensiveness when others point them out. When you've thought carefully about your motivations and values, you're less likely to be swayed by temporary pressures or popular opinions that conflict with your principles. The ultimate goal of using solitude as leadership strength training isn't to become a perfect decision maker or an emotionally invulnerable leader. It's to develop the internal resources to handle whatever challenges arise while maintaining your integrity and effectiveness. Just as physical fitness doesn't prevent injury but increases your capacity to handle physical demands, intellectual and emotional fitness through solitude doesn't prevent leadership challenges but increases your capacity to handle them wisely and effectively. The most profound impact of embracing solitude as a leadership practice extends far beyond your individual effectiveness. When leaders consistently demonstrate the value of thoughtful reflection and strategic withdrawal, they create organizational cultures that prioritize depth over speed, wisdom over reactivity, and quality thinking over constant activity. This cultural shift can transform entire organizations from reactive, crisis-driven environments into proactive, strategically focused institutions. The challenge is that most organizational cultures actively discourage the kind of solitude that produces excellent leadership thinking. Open office designs eliminate private spaces for reflection. Meeting-heavy schedules prevent sustained focus on complex problems. Communication technologies create expectations of immediate response that interrupt deep thinking. Performance metrics often reward activity and availability rather than decision quality and strategic insight. Changing these cultural patterns requires leaders who are willing to model different behavior and explicitly advocate for the value of thinking time. This isn't just about protecting your own solitude. It's about creating organizational norms that enable everyone to do their best thinking and most effective work. Let me tell you about Dr. Elizabeth Harper, who became chief medical officer of a large healthcare system that was struggling with physician burnout, patient satisfaction issues, and financial pressures. The organizational culture was characterized by constant crisis management, with leaders expected to be available for immediate consultation on any problem that arose. Meetings were scheduled back-to-back throughout the day, and important decisions were often made hastily without adequate reflection or analysis. Elizabeth recognized that this reactive culture was actually creating many of the problems the organization was trying to solve. Physicians were making treatment decisions under time pressure that could have been avoided with better planning. Administrative decisions were made without considering long-term implications, creating more problems downstream. Most importantly, nobody had time to think strategically about systemic improvements that could prevent recurring crises. Elizabeth's approach was both personal and institutional. She started by protecting her own thinking time and communicating explicitly about why she was doing so. Instead of just blocking time on her calendar, she would tell colleagues, "I'm taking 2 hours this afternoon to think through the staffing rotation proposal. I want to consider the implications carefully before we make this decision." She would share insights that emerged from these reflection periods, helping people understand the connection between thinking time and decision quality. But Elizabeth went further by institutionalizing the value of reflection throughout the organization. She established what she called decision incubation periods for major policy changes, mandatory waiting periods between when proposals were made and when final decisions were required. This wasn't bureaucratic delay, but deliberate time for stakeholders to think through implications and consider alternatives they might miss under immediate pressure. She also created strategic thinking retreats, quarterly sessions where department heads would spend a full day away from operational demands, focused entirely on long-term planning and systemic improvements. These weren't typical strategic planning meetings with packed agendas and rapid-fire presentations. They were designed specifically to create space for deep thinking about complex challenges. The resistance was significant initially. Many physicians and administrators worried that slowing down decision-making would hurt patient care and operational efficiency. But the results spoke for themselves. Within 18 months, patient satisfaction scores improved significantly, physician burnout decreased, and many chronic operational problems were resolved through solutions that emerged during strategic thinking sessions. The key insight Elizabeth discovered was that urgent decisions rarely require immediate action. They require immediate attention and thoughtful analysis. By distinguishing between these two needs, she was able to maintain responsiveness to genuine emergencies while creating space for careful consideration of important but less time-sensitive issues. This principle applies broadly to leadership challenges. Most situations that feel urgent actually allow time for brief reflection if you can resist the pressure to react immediately. The skill involves quickly assessing whether a situation requires instant response or whether it would benefit from even 15 minutes of careful consideration. In most cases, taking a brief pause to think clearly actually speeds up resolution because you avoid false starts and incomplete solutions that create additional problems. Creating organizational cultures that value solitude and deep thinking also requires addressing the psychological factors that drive constant activity and immediate responsiveness. Many leaders equate busyness with importance and availability with dedication. The underlying fear is that taking time to think might be perceived as laziness or disengagement. This fear is often reinforced by organizational reward systems that recognize visible activity more than thoughtful results. Leaders who attend every meeting and respond to every message immediately are often praised for their dedication, while leaders who deliver better outcomes through more strategic approaches may receive less recognition if their work happens outside public view. Changing these dynamics requires explicit communication about the relationship between thinking quality and leadership effectiveness. When you make better decisions because you've had time to reflect, publicize that connection. When strategic thinking sessions lead to innovative solutions, share the process that generated those insights. Help people understand that some of your most valuable work happens when you're not visible to others. But perhaps the most important cultural change involves normalizing the admission that complex problems require time to think through properly. Many leaders feel pressure to have immediate answers to difficult questions, which leads to premature conclusions and reactive decision-making. Organizations benefit when leaders are comfortable saying, "This is an important decision that deserves careful consideration. Let me think about it and get back to you with a thoughtful response." This approach actually increases rather than decreases stakeholder confidence. When people see that you take important decisions seriously enough to think them through carefully, they trust your judgment more than if you provide immediate answers that may not be well considered. The key is communicating your thinking process so people understand that deliberation is active work, not avoidance of responsibility. The long-term benefits of creating cultures that value deep thinking extend far beyond individual decision-making. Organizations become more innovative because people have time to consider creative approaches to persistent problems. They become more strategic because leaders can think beyond immediate tactical concerns. They become more resilient because problems are addressed at their root causes rather than just their symptoms. These organizations also become more attractive to high-quality leaders and employees who value the opportunity to do their best work rather than just staying busy. People who are capable of excellent thinking often leave organizations that don't provide space for reflection and strategic analysis. By contrast, cultures that support deep thinking tend to attract and retain people who can contribute to long-term success rather than just managing short-term crises. The practical steps for creating these cultural changes include both formal policies and informal modeling. Formal policies might include guidelines about meeting frequency and duration, expectations about response times for non-emergency communications, and regular strategic planning sessions that prioritize reflection over action items. Informal modeling involves consistently demonstrating the value of thoughtful analysis and explicitly discussing how reflection contributes to better outcomes. But the most important element is helping people understand that strategic solitude serves collective interests, not just individual preferences. When you think more clearly, you serve your team more effectively. When you make better decisions, you create better outcomes for everyone affected by those decisions. When you model the value of deep thinking, you give others permission to prioritize reflection over reactivity in their own work. The question that often arises is how to balance the legitimate need for collaboration and stakeholder engagement with the equally legitimate need for solitary reflection. The answer isn't choosing one over the other, but understanding how they work together most effectively. The best collaborative decisions emerge when each participant has had adequate time to think through the issues independently before engaging with others. This creates what I call prepared collaboration, interactions where people bring thoughtful analysis rather than immediate reactions to complex discussions. Instead of using meetings to think out loud or hoping that group discussion will generate clarity, participants come with preliminary insights and specific questions about areas where collective input would be most valuable. The ultimate goal is creating organizational cultures where both solitude and collaboration are valued as essential elements of excellent thinking and decision-making. This isn't about promoting introversion over extroversion or individual work over teamwork. It's about recognizing that some types of thinking happen best in quiet reflection while others happen best in dynamic interaction, and excellent organizations provide space for both. When you've developed this kind of culture, the impact on organizational performance is remarkable. Decisions are better because they're based on careful analysis rather than immediate reactions. Innovation increases because people have time to consider creative approaches. Strategic planning becomes more effective because it's based on deep thinking rather than reactive problem solving. Most importantly, the organization becomes more resilient because it develops the capacity to think through challenges rather than just react to them. The hidden strength of solitude for leaders isn't really hidden at all. It's just forgotten in our hyper-connected, always-on business culture. The most effective leaders throughout history, from Marcus Aurelius to modern executives like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, have understood that their capacity to serve others effectively depends on their ability to think clearly, and thinking clearly requires protection from constant external input and demand. The hidden strength of solitude for leaders isn't really hidden at all. It's just forgotten in our hyper-connected, always-on business culture. The most effective leaders throughout history, from Marcus Aurelius to modern executives like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, have understood that their capacity to serve others effectively depends on their ability to think clearly, and thinking clearly requires protection from constant external input and demand. The Stoic approach to leadership solitude provides a practical framework for reclaiming this essential capability. It's not about becoming isolated or avoiding the collaborative aspects of leadership. It's about understanding that strategic withdrawal enables more effective engagement, that thinking time is productive work, and that some of your most important leadership development happens when you're alone with your thoughts. We've explored how different types of solitude serve different leadership purposes: daily clearing for mental maintenance and priority setting, strategic withdrawal for deep analysis of complex challenges, and philosophical reflection for character development and values clarification. We've seen how solitude functions as strength training for your leadership capabilities, building the cognitive and emotional resources you need to handle increasing responsibility and pressure. Most importantly, we've examined how leaders who embrace solitude create organizational cultures that value deep thinking over reactive activity, quality decisions over quick responses, and strategic planning over crisis management. These cultural changes benefit everyone in the organization, not just the leaders who model them. The practical application starts with small experiments. Begin with 15 minutes of uninterrupted thinking time each morning before checking emails or engaging with immediate demands. Use this time to consider what you want to accomplish that day and how you want to approach anticipated challenges. Notice how this preparation affects your interactions and decision-making throughout the day. Gradually expand your practice to include weekly strategic withdrawal sessions focused on longer-term challenges and monthly philosophical reflection periods where you examine your leadership approach and character development. Protect these times as seriously as you would protect any other important business commitment, and communicate their value to your team so they understand why this time matters. Remember that the goal isn't perfection or complete transformation overnight. The goal is developing the capability to think clearly and deeply about the challenges you face as a leader. This capability will serve you throughout your career, regardless of what specific situations arise or how external circumstances change. The ancient Stoics understood that leadership is ultimately about character, your ability to make good decisions based on wisdom and virtue rather than immediate emotions or external pressures. Character develops through practice, and much of that practice necessarily happens in solitude, where you can examine your thoughts, clarify your values, and align your actions with your principles without the influence or validation of others. In our current business environment, where change happens rapidly and stakes often feel higher than ever, the leaders who thrive will be those who can think clearly under pressure, make decisions based on careful analysis rather than reactive emotions, and maintain their principles while adapting to changing circumstances. These capabilities aren't natural talents that some people have and others don't. They're skills that develop through deliberate practice, and much of that practice happens in strategic solitude. The question isn't whether you need time to think clearly about the challenges you face. Every effective leader needs that time. The question is whether you'll create and protect that time as a legitimate and essential aspect of your leadership responsibility. When you do, you'll discover that the strength you build in solitude amplifies your effectiveness in every other aspect of your leadership role. If this exploration of solitude as leadership strength has provided value, I encourage you to subscribe for more insights that bridge ancient wisdom with modern leadership challenges. Next week, we'll explore how Stoic principles can transform your approach to handling criticism and conflict in leadership roles. Until then, remember that some of your most important work as a leader happens when no one else is watching, in the quiet moments when you're developing the wisdom and character that will guide you through whatever challenges lie ahead.